My name is Jase Kraft. All right, 3 questions. First, do you have a website? And if so, are you able to get people to do whatever you want them to do? Like getting them to buy your books or programs, or maybe even subscribing to your email list. Can you make them do that? Okay, that's the second question. Now the third one is, are you satisfied with the numbers, right? Are you satisfied with the numbers that the viewers and the subscribers, right? Or maybe the buyers, right? Are you satisfied with that numbers? And if not, then this episode is for you. Okay, so today's episode is how to create content on your website that makes people buy. And in this case, we are going to talk about how to sell people to be your subscribers. Okay, because that's what Jase is doing on his website. Because, he's been getting people to opt in to his email newsletter, right? Because he prefers to build relationship first before selling his stuff. Okay, now you might be thinking, who is Jase Kraft, right? So let me introduce him. So Jase got into podcasting with a local podcast called Local Business Heroes, which highlighted business owners. And it wasn't long before he realized that podcasting was his passion. Since that podcast, he has launched 2 other podcasts called Science of Sports Recovery and How to Make Money Podcasting. He launched Perfect My Podcast in 2020 to help podcasters from all walks of life sustain their podcast by helping out with production, promotion, guest management, and growth strategy. He knows that behind every podcast is a passionate host ready to get their message across the world, and it became his duty to help podcasters across the world get their message out. Okay, so that's his intro. Wow, that is so good. That is so good, right? Now before we begin here, make sure to subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. Okay, because you know what happens after you do that. You know what happens after you click that subscribe button. All right, let me tell you. First, you are able to make money on demand every time you post something on your social media. Okay, so that's the first. Secondly, you don't have to worry about not getting enough leads or customers because you always get more. All right, that is so cool. So that's what I can promise once you do that. Now click that subscribe or follow button right now. Okay, anyway, just to let you know that this is the first part of the whole conversation, right? And yeah, let's begin. So here are some of the biggest questions when it comes to content marketing. Why does the content that gets tons of likes and comments does not make more money than the one with a few likes? And why do some influencers with more than 10,000 followers are still broke while the ones with a few hundreds only make a fortune? And how come the content that is so good still cannot make people buy while the simplest one can? Well, today, people are obsessed with the number of followers, likes, and comments whenever they put out a content. And the truth is, those things are what makes people broke. So, how do these successful marketers create content that generates money? Those are the questions, and on this podcast, you'll find the answers. I'm your host, Jase Kraft, and you're listening to Content Marketing Hacks. Hey Jase, welcome to the Content Marketing Hacks podcast. I'm so glad to have you here.
Ashraf, it's good to be here.
Awesome. So before we get into all this amazing stuff, I really want to know why did you start podcasting? I mean, I know you have an athlete background, but why choose podcasting afterwards?
Yeah, so I started podcasting because I was in software sales, and it was a way for me to make more sales through my podcasting. And I quickly learned that I liked the podcasting part of it more than I liked the software sales part of it. So I kind of leaned into that, and then my first ever podcast was just interviewing local businesses in the Sioux Falls, my local market, about what they do for their business, and then talking a little bit about software and processes and that kind of stuff. And then I started another podcast called The Science of Sports Recovery, because I am an athlete, like you had mentioned. I was an athlete in college, ran a 4:10 mile, and now I'm training for Spartan, like obstacle course racing events. And I wanted to learn from the professionals and from the researchers, like really how to get the most out of your body, right? And I knew from my previous experience podcasting that if I started a podcast, I'd have access to talk to these really intelligent people that knew more than me, because you had a reason then to, right? Because you could host them on your podcast and stuff. So that was kind of the initial reason why I started that podcast.
Wow. Okay. So that means you have 3 podcasts now?
So I have software? 2 now, because I have How to Make Money Podcasting. That's the one that I started just a couple months ago. And then I have since stopped the local podcast here. Wow.
That's powerful. And what happens to the first podcast? Did you do anything about it?
I'm not in software sales anymore. So I'm full-time podcast production, podcast editing, and that kind of stuff. So I transitioned from that local business type of podcast to more general, like just how to make money podcasting podcast, because then that facilitates kind of the growth of my new business.
I see. So you have a company called Perfect My Podcast, and then you have a show about helping people how to make money from podcasts, right?
Yeah.
So did you why did you decide to help people in podcasting? I mean, you said that you create a podcast because you want to talk to experts.
Yeah.
But why did you decide to help a local business in podcasting?
Yeah. So it's kind of a funny story how I got into the actual podcast production and editing part of this is when I started the Science of Sports Recovery podcast, then I had 2 podcasts, and I was like, well, I didn't know any other podcaster. Like, I was just kind of off in my own little world doing this thing, figuring it out by myself. And, I had marketing background and software background, so I knew my way around stuff. But I had never actually talked to anybody else that was doing it. So I had posted on Facebook in a few different groups and just asking people if I hosted a networking event specifically for podcasters, like just virtual, online, face-to-face, kind of meeting, would anybody come? And overnight I had 300 people message me or comment on my posts and stuff. So then I knew, like, okay, there's a podcasting community that's like thriving or thirsty for community, for actual community, not just like kind of, forums and those kinds of stuff. So that's when I kind of delved into the podcasting community and started hosting these networking events twice a month for podcasters, just to kind of learn something from a speaker, and then to get together and talk about podcasting, the struggles, the benefits, the what's working, what's not afterwards. And so I've been doing that twice a month. And then as I got deeper into the podcasting community, that's when I realized there was a real need for the post-production part of it, the audio editing, video editing, image creation, marketing, those kinds of things. And then that's what I decided to serve. And then that led into the next podcast. So.
Oh, so what I'm really amazed, you even created a virtual summit about podcast growth. And that was like a few months ago, right? And so you help podcasters, and you even have a networking event for podcasters. So what kind of challenges that you face when helping podcasters, or maybe helping local business to start a podcast? What kind of challenges you face?
Yeah, so there's several challenges that I think every podcaster kind of goes through, and it's a lot of mental stuff. There's kind of like mental, and then there's just like the lack of knowledge. So, and when I say like it's mental, it's like I'm afraid to get behind the mic because I don't like the sound of my voice, or I don't think that I am knowledgeable about a subject, but I actually am, or those kinds of things where I'm not good enough to do. Who am I to have a podcast on a certain subject? Those are the kind of mental barriers that a lot of people have. And that you just kind of got to work through, like, okay, you don't have to. The biggest one I see is, who am I to have a podcast on this subject? Because I'm not an expert. Mm-hmm. Well, all the podcasts that I've started this far, I haven't been an expert in when starting. I started them to learn from the experts, and then I just facilitate the conversation. And to your point about content marketing for this podcast, is you're learning and producing content for your potential audience, so it's kind of a win-win there anyways. So you don't have to be the expert. That's kind of the first mental shift that people need to get over. The second thing is just lack of knowledge on how to do things like audio editing, video editing, where to upload your podcast so it gets distributed on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and Spotify and all those other little ones that nobody's heard about, and podcast website. Do you need one? How do you book a guest? All those little things. We can help with that, or otherwise our, networking events really help with getting people comfortable with that and stuff. So that's just about knowledge. But the one thing I would say on that is people use the lack of knowledge as an excuse. They say, I don't know how to edit audio, so I'm not going to do a podcast, when a podcast could like really change their life, right? But they use that as an excuse. You can always find somebody to edit your audio. It's going to cost you a little bit of money, or you can learn it yourself. There's, different ways, and it's not that hard. Podcasting is not that hard. It's just a matter of actually doing it, being consistent, and, producing the content.
All right. So two things, the mental barrier and the techie stuff. Okay. So how do you tell them to overcome these challenges?
Yeah, so for the mental part of it, it's a lot of like coaching, understanding who they are as a person, and where they want to go. What's the purpose of this podcast? Is it about them? Is it about other people? And that's gonna kind of dictate, like, are you gonna be able to move forward? Some people won't ever get past the mental hurdles of podcasting because they can't get past the sound of their voice, or and that's okay. Podcasting is not for everybody. You don't have to, just because like it's kind of on a very steep incline as far as popularity and trending. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean you have to have a podcast. It can be beneficial, but if it doesn't fit your personality, that's okay. So that's the first thing we say, like, is a podcast right for you? And then if we do determine that it is, then it's starting to work through, okay, why don't you like the sound of your voice? Or why don't you think you're good enough? Or maybe just thinking of, like, they have a vision of their podcast, or a vision of what podcasting is that's not actually true, right? Because if the barrier is, hey, I'm not an expert in this subject, like for me, sports recovery, like, I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not an athletic trainer, just an athlete here. So I know some of the lingo, but I didn't know how to put it together. So I didn't have to be the expert. But that wasn't a barrier for me, because I knew I could interview the experts, right? So that's kind of the mental shift. And then for the technical side, it's just, I mean, you can learn anything you want through YouTube, Google, or some sort of course that's online. Right now, I don't sell any courses. I might potentially in the future, but like the information is out there for free, and you just got to go find it. If you want help finding that information, talk to somebody who's doing it, like myself or yourself, or any, if you know somebody who's podcasting and you want to do it, like just ask them, how do you edit the audio? Like, is it hard? Can you show me? What software do you use? That's kind of the first step. What software do you use? And then learn how to use the software. Those are, the two things that I would suggest.
Yeah. About the podcaster that did not like their voice. I do find it funny that there's actually a lot of podcasters that hate their voice. I even asked the top podcasters, like Johnny Dumas and Jeremy's. I don't remember the name, but there are a lot of top podcasters that actually hate their voice. So I do think that it's natural to hate it.
Because it sounds different to you. I mean, you hear your voice through the bones in your face, and I mean, obviously everybody else doesn't hear that. So then when it's actually recorded and you're hearing how it actually sounds, you've been living with a different voice, in your head this whole time than what's actually out there. But I will say it gets better as you listen to it. I don't listen to a lot of my own podcasts just because like I've already had the conversation, so I'm listening more for quality check than to actually enjoy listening to myself talk. But I would say as you record yourself, you get more comfortable with being recorded, being live, being in front of people and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. So, Jase, I think we can get into the topic here. The topic is, how to monetize your content. Actually, I have no right title yet. I haven't come up with the right title, so it's all about how to monetize your content. So, since you are all about podcasting, you even have a company that's a production company for podcasting. So, you might as well know a lot about this stuff, right? So, I kind of want to know, how do you monetize your podcast?
There are a ton of ways to monetize your podcast, and that's what my podcast, How to Make Money Podcasting, is all about, is interviewing podcasters who are doing that, what ways they're doing that. But I'll kind of break it down in a couple different avenues for your listeners for some takeaways here. The first way, and I would say the least thought of way that can be the most impactful, is if you have a company and you have a podcast, if you interview your ideal customers, you'll make sales that way. Even if nobody listens to your podcast, you'll make sales interviewing your ideal customer, because inevitably they'll either ask, what you do, what your podcast is about, who you serve, those kinds of things. They'll come up during the podcast as you're interviewing them, or talking to them and say, we have, a service that does this, or a product that does this. And they'll hear that and they'll be like, oh, I actually need that, or I could use that. Let's talk about that later. So that's where I made a lot of sales in my local business podcast, because I was just interviewing my ideal customer and I didn't really care if anybody listened to it or not. I was making sales through the interviews. Now, the caveat to this is the interview can't be a sales pitch, right? You can't go into the interview and say, hey, want to be on my podcast, and then just asking them basically sales questions to try to close them, right? It has to be some sort of like, I want to highlight you to an audience that, is relevant to them, as well as, asking them, key questions things that are going to trigger for you if there would be a good fit for your product, right? So if I was selling, podcast production services, and I asked a podcaster, like, so do you do all your editing yourself, or do you, use somebody else on the show? Because then it provides value to the podcasters listening, saying, okay, this person's at this level now, she's outsourced, or he's outsourced, or he's still doing it all himself. But I also have that information now if I know they're using a competitor, or if they haven't outsourced yet, and I can follow up with that potentially later. So that's the first way, is interview your ideal customers. The second way, most common way, or most commonly thought of, it's actually not the most common way, but the most commonly thought of is sponsorships. So you have a podcast, you have an audience, say like you have a craft beer podcast where you talk about craft beer or something. You could have a sponsor, about a beer sponsor potentially that's going to want to get in front of your ideal audience. They pay you for a 30 to 60 second slot on the podcast. That's a way to monetize kind of your podcast. That's probably the most thought of. It's also potentially one of the hardest to do, just because you have to, if you're a niche podcast. So I know of a lady, Heidi K. Begay on Flute 360 podcast. So shout out to her. She has a very niche podcast, right? It's for flutists, about how to be a flutist and teaching flutistness about the instrument. What?
Okay. What is that?
A flute is an instrument, like a trumpet or a trombone or a guitar. It's an instrument that you play. So it's about that. She gets a very good sponsor package, based because she only talks to that niche audience, the people that play the flute. And so flute manufacturers want to be in front of that audience, right? So it's an easier sale for her. Whereas if you have a podcast like, the Joe Rogan Experience, where it's interviewing celebrities, it's not that niche as far as you can't nail down who's listening to the podcast, then it's harder to sell sponsorships because you have to have such a volume of downloads to do that. And to make it actually worth your time and money. So the second avenue is sponsorships. And then the last one before I'll kind of wrap up here my thought and let you kind of ask, lead in questions from here, is the third one is selling your own products and services. And this is where most like businesses, if you have a business already and you start a podcast, this is the route that you're going to take, is promoting your own products and services. So, if you have a podcast about, content creation and you help people, create content, then having an ad in that podcast directing people to your website or to, a lead form or some sort of that kind of thing. That's what a lot of podcasts do and are.
Yeah, that's powerful. Three different ways. Okay. I have done the first one and the third one, and I have never done the second one yet, because I think that's the easiest one for me. And, did you learn the first one from someone? Because I believe that I've heard that method before. Is it from Jamie Atkinson or someone?
I wouldn't know. I actually didn't learn it from somebody. It just kind of happened on my own podcast. So, like I said, when I started podcasting, I knew nobody else who was podcasting besides the podcasts that I listened to, which were really marketing or sales or software type podcasts. But there wasn't any podcasts about podcasting. So when I started, it was, in my mind, I was like, I'm going to build influence in my community, and then people are going to listen to the podcast and then reach out to me and want to buy software. That was in my mind. What was in reality, it was the people I was actually interviewing. Those were the people that were like, oh yeah, I should learn more about that. Right. So it was kind of from perception to reality was different there. And then that's when I learned like, oh, this is a good way to do it.
Yeah. Because I'm familiar with that method, and I thought you would learn it from someone. But yeah, that's cool that you have discovered that on your own. And right. So do you have a content plan in your podcast, or maybe in your social media, specifically in social media? I don't know. Do you have any content calendar?
Yeah, so we have a content plan for each of our podcasts that we manage and that I host. It's pretty simple. We're how many times a month or a week is this podcast produced, right? So then you set that on a weekly or monthly basis out into the future indefinitely. So for most of the podcasts I work with, they're a weekly show. So every Tuesday, let's say, you post the podcast, and then that goes out to YouTube and to your podcast host, and then to the podcast players. And then we take down, depending on what the podcaster wants for promotional package, we say, okay, you want this many videos, this many quote graphics, a cover photo, etc. And then we space that out over the week or the interval between each podcast. And then that's basically a content plan. So you'll see like Monday through Friday, here's what's posted on Monday, here's what's posted on Tuesday, here's what's posted on Thursday or Wednesday, etc. And then every time we get the podcast recorded and we have that audio video now our team knows what to, like, how many videos to create, how many quotes, and etc. And then we just start posting.
Wow, that's an awesome plan. There's too much work. I mean, for you, if you have a company, then that may be easy for you, right? But okay, that's cool. So back to when you mentioned about there's not much podcast about podcasting. I actually I'm curious about how I actually found out like 4 podcasts about podcasting. So how do you stand out from them? What is unique about your podcast?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of podcasts about podcasting because if you're a podcaster, then you know about podcasting. So the next logical step is to teach people how to podcast, right? And there's a lot of people that will do editing services. There's a lot of podcasting like services out there. There's a lot of competition. What I found that was missing, and you should do this in any kind of market. If you're going to start a podcast, you should research the podcast in the market before you start a podcast. There's 2 things that I noticed with this podcast. One was I just wanted to talk to podcasters anyways. So even if I was kind of like run of the mill, the same as every other podcast, I was like, it's going to be beneficial to me because I'm actually talking to podcasters, right?
Yeah.
So if nobody listened to it, I'm still getting benefit. That was number 1. I was like, okay, so I'm going to do this anyways. Number 2 is, what are all the other podcasters doing in that space, in that niche? A lot of them are like either saying, here's how to podcast. It's kind of like a monologue of one person telling, here's how to set up this, here's how to do this, here's how to get a sponsor, here's how to do that. Or, 2 or 3 people talking, but it's always the same host, right? And then a lot of them are about the business type of podcast. And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to monetize a podcast in the business services than it is in probably any other podcast. So I wanted to highlight podcasters outside and inside of the business niche. and how they're actually creating podcasts. Because if I'm creating income from my podcast, how to make money podcasting, right? It's not as relatable to somebody who has, say, a flute podcast or a podcast about turtles or, an audio drama podcast or a health, vegan podcast. It's not as relatable, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to highlight podcasters from all different industries and how they're making money doing that. So we've had people on from, kind of the gaming sci-fi niche to flute, to content creators, to just like powerful, inspiring stories, and everything in between. So we've had quite the variety, and they all make money a little bit differently, right? So we have the three that I told you earlier, but there's all these other different ways through like Patreon or through getting a speaking gig at, a live event or a virtual event. And so I'm just exploring some of those different avenues with these other people that I haven't even done myself yet. So it's not coming necessarily from one man's perspective. It's coming from kind of a community of podcasters. And there might be an episode that resonates with you because it's closer to your niche. That's great. But there also might be something that's outside of your niche that you take and apply to your niche, and you could be the first one who's ever done it. So maybe your niche doesn't have any sort of like virtual conferences that you can speak at. And you're like, hey, that's cool. Why don't I start my own virtual conference? Right. Yeah. So it's like trying to take the variety of industries and then apply it to your own.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, I hope you enjoyed our conversation and got so many golden nuggets. Okay, now that you have listened to the end, I have got a free gift for you. And it's not a masterclass or a webinar or some trainings, okay? It's a real gift, I promise. Okay, what is it you say? All right, I'm gonna give you a podcast microphone for free. That's right, you heard that right, baby. It's free. I'm going to give you a podcast microphone for free. And if you're doing a podcast, then you may need this microphone, Okay, and keep in mind, I can only give 1,000 of these away for free, so get it now before it runs out. So you can get it at bit.ly/free podcast mic. Again, that's bit.ly/free podcast mic. The link is in the description below if you don't get it right. Okay, so get it now before it runs out. All right. Now, always remember that content creators get liked, but content marketers get paid.